This story begins with some not-so-good times. On the day on which this story begins, there was a bloody battle. The man who had killed the last warrior stood over him with his huge sword. Behind him was also his army, which was massacring everyone else. But then suddenly some of his opponents ran to attack him, while shouting at the same time for him, the bloody monster, to die already at last. But the latter calmly slit their throats with just one swing of his sword, and looked at him with a cold stare as he finished the last one. But at that moment, the man felt a strange pain in his head. He hoped it wasn't happening right now, because this wasn't the right time. The man realized that if he transformed into a dragon right now, he would be in trouble. He looked down at his hand and saw that claws were beginning to appear instead of fingers. But then suddenly he heard someone shouting behind him. It was his assistant, who ran up to His Highness and asked if he was all right. But seeing that it was even hard for him to stand, he supported him, telling him to keep himself in control. After all, he shouldn't lose control of himself, not in this situation. In the blink of an eye, His Highness's hand became human again. The man sighed heavily and realized that his assistant was right after all. He still had 10 days before he could finally die like a real person. However, if fate does sting over him and allow him one more opportunity, more than anything else, he wants to see the beautiful girl one last time before he dies. At this very time, the girl with blonde hair went outside, where the first snow had already started to fall. Picking up one of the snowflakes, she put it to her chest and thought about the fact that it had even started snowing already. But it bothered her a great deal that Layla had left, and she had never been gone so long before. She couldn't understand what had made her so late. Yes, and not only Layla, the bishops who lived with them were not seen together on this day either. But she realized that the girl didn't have much time left. So this situation bothered her a lot. She had no way of knowing where Layla had disappeared to after all. And at that moment she remembered how she and her sister had gone into the forest with the bishops in the past. The girls held hands and were very anxious about what the future held for them. One of the bishops said to Layla that she could begin. The sister who held her hand was very nervous until Layla reassured her that everything was fine. At this moment, the girl came closer and, reaching her hand forward, began to emit a bright light from it. The little sprout that was in the ground suddenly began to grow very fast, turning into the greatest tree in just a second. When the bishops saw this, they were shocked, and the Vickies expected Layla to have incredible strength. But they realized that this was the truest evidence that she was a holy maiden. Her sister already wanted to intercede for Layla, telling her that if she kept stressing like this, she'd be in trouble. Most importantly, however, the bishop grabbed her hand, smiled, and asked what Helena was even doing. When the girl looked around, she immediately tensed up, for the others looked her straight in the eye and told her that it was her turn to show them her powers. Elena was very worried about it, because she had never done this before. But she was very hopeful that it would work out. This time she had to do what her sister did. However, as soon as she approached the empty ground to which the tree was supposed to grow, nothing happened. The girl made every possible effort, but she failed. The sprout didn't even make it out of the ground. When the bishops saw this, they were surprised. They did not understand how two girls who were twins, both born with the same half of the holy mark, could have different powers and abilities. Now that it was getting darker, remembering it all, Elena was even more disappointed. It had hurt her deeply as a child, but now it was beginning to heal a little. In fact, according to long-standing legend, in order to provide protection, the Tree of Life Powerful entrusted this land to two trusted guardians. A dragon of incomparable power and a holy maiden who brings peace through healing. However, over time the dragon fell in love with this holy maiden, and soon he took the form of a man, in order to become Emperor of Ilanfera, and decreed that men should live in the worship of the Holy Virgin. However, the dragon's duty was only to protect the Tree of Life, and angry that the dragon had neglected his duty, the Mighty One said that of those who would inherit the blood, he would take his share of the mightiest and wisest sons. After that dragon-like thing, many people were born who possessed strength that surpassed ordinary humans, but none of them escaped an early death. When the Holy Virgin, who had fallen in love with the dragon's offspring, wept and asked the Mighty One for forgiveness, he mercifully answered her prayer. Thus the marriage of the holy maiden and the dragon's offspring ushered in a new era of glorious empire. However, Elena was now very doubtful. She thought about the fact that if the legend was really true, she didn't understand why she and Layla had been born twins, and why she didn't have the power to protect anyone. In fact, it's been a whole 10 years since Layla's engagement. Of the prince's crowns, there are less than 10 days left until the day they are married. And so, when Layla leaves the estate, Elena is left to spend the rest of her life alone in this temple forever, because she doesn't have the same powerful abilities as her sister. The girl stood like that on the bridge and gazed into the distance until, as darkness fell, one of the bishops came out, and, when he saw the girl, greeted her, saying that he had been looking for her for a long time. He walked closer to her, and said that he had heard rumors that she had been looking for Layla all day. The girl bowed to him and said that she had, but she hadn't been able to find her, unfortunately. When she looked the bishop straight in the eye and asked, "Did something really happen to Layla?" He said nothing for a while, but pondered the answer. Then the man, coming closer to her, said that apparently the decision the Archbishop had made in the past was wrong after all, but she could rejoice because the Mighty One had discovered her calling. He suddenly grabbed her by the shoulders and said in a cold voice slowly, "Layla disappeared without a trace. That's why Elena should marry the crown prince instead of her." When the girl heard this, she was horrified. She didn't know how to even react to such a situation. Soon afterward, the bishop began to take her somewhere on the estate. They went down the stairs for a very long time, and the girl did not know when the end would come. They went lower and lower down the dark corridors, and she wondered very much where that secret staircase led. Soon a bright light suddenly began to shine through. When the girl looked in that direction, she realized that she was in a room she had never been allowed into before. In fact, it was a sacred room where all the bishops hold their meetings and discuss various matters. The man who had brought Helena to this hall greeted his lordship and said that he had brought the girl already. When the most important archbishop heard this, he said in a sad voice that it only meant that she had indeed run away, leaving her sister behind, and it was very cruel of her to do so. But then, after a moment's thought, he said that maybe it was even a cause for joy. He reached closer to Elena and said that she had a purpose in life now, didn't he? But afterward he immediately shooed her away, saying that he assumed she had already been told the big news. When the archbishop said, turning away from the girl, that they were going to the palace together as soon as the carriage arrived within 10 days. But he also said that she should not forget that when she arrived, the girl should wear an image and behave uprightly like the Holy Virgin Layla. When Elena heard this, she was very surprised, but then she lowered her gaze and became sad. The girl turned to his lordship and said that he knew perfectly well that she did not possess the powers of the Holy Virgin. However, the man said it didn't matter because he doubted that the emperor was interested in growing greens. In fact, most would consider a marriage between the descendants of a dragon and a holy maiden to be a simple, ordinary marriage. However, the true purpose of such a marriage is to hide some inconvenient truth about this earth. Yes, and the truth of the matter is that one who continues to harness the powers of dragons eventually becomes that very dragon. When Elena heard that, she was very surprised, but she kept a cold expression on her face. In fact, up until now, she'd thought all those stories about the dragon's power were just legend. But apparently, according to the Archbishop, this is not true at all. And it's not just some legend, it's actually true. The girl then inquired as to what eventually happens when one becomes completely dragonized. The priest was silent for a while, then turned and smiled and said that in time she would know the answer to that question herself. He also said that man could delay his transformation into a dragon through the power of the Holy Virgin. However, it is completely impossible to avoid the fate of becoming a dragon. Crown Prince Kyle Ilafer began roaming the battlefields and causing bloodshed when he was only 16 years old, though at that point he hardly knew that the more one used his dragon power, the closer he became to becoming one himself. In any case, no one knows or suspects anything as long as Elena behaves herself. Before his transformation, the girl had already wanted to object, saying that in such a case it was not worth it. However, the Archbishop looked at her angrily and said that he could see that she still did not understand the gravity of the situation. Then he explained to her again that with her sister's disappearance, they had only two choices. If they ruled out sending her to the palace instead of Layla, they had only one choice left, and that was to tell the emperor the truth that the sacred maiden was missing. Then he turned to Helena and asked if she really thought the emperor would be calm when he heard this terrible news. But without waiting for her answer, he said that of course he wouldn't. He would turn the whole temple upside down just to find the holy girl, and if his men found out about Helen during the search, it would be very bad. Bishop will have nothing else to do but admit that the Holy Virgin has a twin sister, and that they have been silent about it all this time. So he, as Archbishop, decided that it was better to get rid of her than to send the whole temple to the gallows for betraying the emperor's trust. So he wants Elena Underwood to tell him what her choices are, marriage or death, not only her own but that of innocent people. Of course, the girl had nothing else to do but to agree to this proposal. So the very day of the wedding came very soon. The maids were helping Helena to get ready for this important event and fancying up the girl to make her look even more like Layla. In fact, as the Archbishop had told her, not a single person suspected her, or rather not a single person was even interested in her. Of course, Elena isn't too worried about it, but it actually seems all very strange to her. The dragon descendant is part of the imperial family, and the crown prince's safety could be jeopardized. Therefore, the girl doesn't understand why they don't bring any inquiries about her. She got the impression as if they weren't interested in what would eventually happen to her, but she realizes that worrying about it is probably completely futile. She might be able to fool everyone else, but except the prince, who had familiarized himself with Lady Layla in his youth. And if he suddenly finds out that she is not who she says she is, they will not be able to escape the emperor's wrath. Soon the girl was fully packed and on her way to her wedding Sarevna. As soon as the doors opened, she saw the beautiful hall decorated for Layla and the crown prince's ceremony. But all she could think about was that she didn't want to die. The girl really hoped that if someone was watching her from somewhere, she wanted someone to share her courage with. Soon Elena was standing at the altar, but she was even starting to get worried, just like the rest of the guests. Many people looked at their watches and could but pity the holy maiden of this generation. For to shave the betrothed soon principal is a terrible thing. However, this man's friend told him to keep his voice down if he didn't want to lose his head right now. People did not realize when the crown prince would arrive, for the bride had been standing all alone at this altar for hours. People realized that at this rate the sun would soon set, and the prince was still not staying. Elena had indeed been standing alone in front of all the people for quite some time now, but she shouldn't have lost her dog, for Layla wouldn't be bothered by such words. So the girl stood with her head proudly raised and did not show a single emotion on her face. As the Archbishop watched the girl, he saw that she was able to maintain her composure even in such a terribly awkward situation. And now it made sense to him why Kyle had behaved himself when he mentioned his fiancée's name. But at that moment, an aide suddenly approached him, and apologizing for the distraction, asked if the man was sure the crown prince would even show up for the event. He also fears that sending Prince Kalof on an expedition on the eve of his wedding was a completely unwise decision. But the Archbishop interrupted him at the last sentence, and asked him if he himself was not curious. The man looked at him in surprise, and asked what it was that he should be so curious about. Maybe then the man explained that he was always obligated to follow any orders at the mention of his fiancée. Therefore the Archbishop wants to see with his own eyes the extent of his seriousness. In fact, the man really wants Kyle Ihlenfair to show how far he is willing to go to get what he wants, because that will determine the direction of his future actions. Soon, however, the guests began whispering loudly and looking backward. Elena, seeing all this, also looked toward the front doors. When people saw a man in black armor start to appear in the open doorway, they were surprised. When they looked more closely, they noticed that he was covered in blood. The man, stepping closer into the hall, began to remove his helmet and showed his face. When Elena saw it, she realized that it just couldn't be. She didn't want to accept this situation. The man with a calm expression continued walking straight down the aisle, ignoring the surprised people who sat on the sides. People could not understand and believe that this man was really the crown prince, and had come to his own wedding in such an outfit. However, one of the guests asked them to be quiet, because this man was carrying a sword given to him by the emperor himself, and they would all be beheaded if they continued to talk like this. Elena understood perfectly well that a true crown prince would not have gone to his own wedding ceremony in such a terrible state. However, the Archbishop, when he saw it, only laughed loudly, almost to the whole hall. And yet Elena, looking carefully around the room, realized that the Emperor was laughing and no one was blocking the path of the man in armor. And that can only mean that the Crown Prince himself is coming to her, the man who will very soon be her lawful husband. The man tossed his bloody helmet aside somewhere, apologizing for the wait. And walking up the aisle, he sighed heavily, requesting that they already exchange vows and be done with this ceremony. But as soon as Kyle looked at the girl who stood across from him, his heart immediately began to beat even harder. The man began to remember the moments he had spent with Layla and the vow he had made to her then. Elena, in turn, watched the man in surprise, not understanding what would happen next. Kyle was surprised himself. He didn't know why the girl was looking at him so intently. It even made him tense. But soon he began to move closer to her, and thought about how her look to him reminded him more of the look of someone who had just seen a ghost. He then shifted his gaze to his hand, which was slowly starting to turn into claws again, and quickly hit it to his armor. When he was already quite close to the girl, he held out his healthy hand, and asked that she also give hers so they could do it properly. Elena regarded his face in surprise for a while, but after that she still gave him her hand, as the man began to recite his vows. He said he was Kyle, and solemnly swore to take her, Layla Underwood, as his wife. Then he began to put a ring on the girl's hand, and said that they would be husband and wife until death do them part. When the ceremony was over, Kyle went back to his room and sat by the window for a while, thinking about everything that had happened. In fact, when he saw the girl then, he couldn't understand why she was at the altar. But at that moment someone suddenly knocked on the room, and the man immediately grabbed his blade, which was lying nearby, and taking out the blade, inquired who it was. The maid answered. She said that his wife, the crown princess, wished to see him and apologize for disturbing him. Then the man walked over and, opening the door, was very surprised at the sight of the girl. In fact, Elena was already in her nightclothes, but even though the makeup and hair were already washed off, the girl still looked very enchanting. Kyle just stared at her for a while, then pulling her closer to him, he told her she could come in. After that, the maid went about her business, and Helena, closing the door behind her, stood at the entrance and did not know what she should do next. Kyle stood for a while, only glancing at his now wife. Then, when he saw her continue to stand, he asked if she would walk a little farther. The girl immediately became anxious. She realized that he might be suspicious if she kept quiet, so she would have to be sure to act like Layla. Elena took a deep breath and realized that there was no way her sister would have lost her composure, even in a situation like this. Then, breathing out a sigh of relief, she turned to her husband in a calm voice and told him that she still didn't know what he wanted from her. Kyle, hearing this, was very surprised. However, the girl continued. She said that if he intended to possess her, she would be his, but if not, she would just leave. The man was silent for a while, but then suddenly he saw that she had her hand on her breast, but she was trembling with fear. So he said in a cold voice that even though she was trembling while talking, but he still didn't understand her words. The man then turned around and said that he had heard from the bishops that she had been blindfolded for the carriage ride, and wondered if it was true. Elena was a little surprised, but said that was correct. And then the man continued. He said that in that case, she hadn't had a chance to see it all properly. At that moment, he went to the window and pulled open the curtains, pointing to the beautiful view that was visible from his chambers. Helena was surprised when she saw the beautiful light that came from the tree nearby. This plant she saw was the Tree of Life. It stood majestically in the center of the empire, and it received one name for being the first plant to put down roots in this world. Elena moved closer and began to scrutinize each of its petals, for it was truly mesmerizing. In fact, the girl had heard of the tree only sprouting leaves when a dragon descendant was born. But this was the first time she could see it in person. The girl, after examining a little more, said in an enthusiastic voice that it seemed the flowers might bloom quite soon, and this surprised her very much. Kyle only smiled slightly when he heard that. Then he took her by the shoulder and pulled her closer to him. The man said that indeed, just as she had said, the flowers would bloom quite soon. Until then, it would be too late. At that moment, he began to move his face as close to hers as possible. Then, in a quiet voice, he asked her if she had forgotten her duty. The girl said in a calm voice that her duty was to delay his transformation. However, she did not have time to finish the sentence, for the man interrupted her and said that it was not true. Once the flowers of the tree of life bloomed, then their dragon would irrevocably turn into him. In other words, he will lose his humanity and become a complete monster capable of nothing more than killing. And he added that he believes she hasn't forgotten the promise she made to him 8 years ago. Kyle put his blade in her hand and told her that she had sworn to free him before he turned into a dragon. The girl, hearing this, was genuinely surprised. It left her horrified. She hadn't expected Layla to promise such a thing. But Kyle, with a smile on his face, asked Layla to kill him, as there was indeed hope in his eyes. He then pointed his hand to the center of his chest and asked her to stab him in that spot with all her strength. He even knelt down to make it easier for the girl to do so. They stood in silence for a while. Elena still had a hard time knowing if she had heard everything correctly. She found it hard to believe that the crown prince wanted her to kill him. She couldn't figure out if he was really telling her to kill the man she'd met for the first time that day. Elena didn't know what she should do in this situation, and thought that maybe the best solution would be to just tell him the truth. Her hands trembled as she held that blade. The girl realized that she had to say that she was not Layla, the one who had made him a promise. Emotions got the better of her, so she tossed the blade aside. The weapon hit the floor with a clatter, and Kyle looked at the girl without much surprise. Elena, in a great panic, screamed, saying that she wouldn't do it. She didn't even look him in the eye, because she was too surprised and frightened by the situation. Then the man started to get up from his knees and asked how it was that she wouldn't. But without waiting for an answer, he said that in that case there was no point in staying, and if she didn't intend to fulfill his promise, she should leave right now this palace. They stood in complete silence for a while, and Elena tried to figure out what was even going on and how she should proceed. The girl was alarmed when the man asked her to leave the palace. It meant that she would have to return to that horrible temple. But at that moment, she remembered the Archbishop telling her to remember that everyone would be waiting for her, that she would not give them away, for death would be waiting for her on her return. So the girl understood perfectly well that she could not go back to that place. But she had only one way out, just to take and kill this man, whom she had never seen before in her life. She was silent the whole time. Kyle, seeing the fear on her face, asked why she was hesitating in her decision. He got as close as he could to the girl that theirs had almost touched yesterday, and told her that if she didn't kill him right here and now, she would be the one to face him when he turned into a dragon. Elena felt uneasy, and all she could ask was how could this have happened. Kyle didn't really like this topic. However, he had to explain and said that a dragon descendant possessed a body that was practically immortal, and neither a sword strike nor a flame could kill him, because his body would simply regenerate. However, the only one who can kill such a person is a holy maiden. Elena, when she heard this, was even more amazed. She couldn't even believe that this was what the Archbishop was telling her. She thought about the fact that surely the Archbishop must have turned in perfectly well, and realized that she would eventually know the answer. Perhaps he had a name in mind for this situation. Kyle took her by the shoulders and told her that if she didn't fulfill his wish for a human to die, he was asking her to at least fulfill his other request. With a very sad look, he asked that she not stay by his side. They stood in silence for a while, Elena trying to think of what to say to him. The cold wind from the open window blew her hair, which helped her think better. In order to contain her emotions, she squeezed her dress tightly and asked what would happen if she refused the request. The girl started screaming and grabbed his arm and asked if he really wanted her to run away and save her skin. After calming down a bit, Elena lowered her gaze and said that if she did that, everyone would either be killed or injured. And who knows what the angry residents would do to him in general. When Kyle heard this, he removed his hands and said it was pretty absurd that she still cared about other people's lives despite her plight. And after these words, to Elena's surprise, he took her in his arms and put her on his shoulder. The girl was surprised for a while and could not do anything, but then she started trying to get off his shoulder, asking what he was doing, and asked that he put her back down on the ground immediately. Of course, the man didn't listen, and only went on his own, walking toward the door. He said that if she didn't want to leave on her own, he would send her out of the place on her own. He walked over to the painting that hung by the door and pushed it aside to look at the tunnel that opened beyond. Elena, seeing that they were going down some dark corridor, asked where he was taking her. She was ready to beg him not to. As they began to descend lower and lower, there was finally a light. It was the torches that hung along the walls, and Kyle said she needn't worry. He also said that she would be able to escape this nightmare when she got out of Elan Fair. When the girl heard that, she was very surprised. She continued to resist, his family in his arms, and asked if he was really going to drive her out of these lands just like that. The man at this point set her on the ground and asked, "Wasn't it clear why they sent her to this place? All they care about is achieving their goal. Her safety is of no importance to them." He also said that there is not a soul on this earth who would thank her for such a sacrifice. Elena, hearing those words, thought that he was right after all. But if she left, she didn't know what would happen to the man who had just saved her life. Soon the dark tunnel finally ended, and Kyle led the girl outside, where her horse was already waiting for her. The man pointed her in the direction of a guy who was standing next to this horse, and told her to go with this man. Elena heard this and immediately got worried and asked what he would do when she left. The girl continued talking and said that apparently it was true what the bishops had said. Probably would suffer the consequences if she left. However, she didn't say the next sentence, but only thought about the fact that if she went back to the temple, she would be killed as well. She knows she's in no position to worry about anyone else right now, but she can't help but ask the question. And with a desperate voice, Elena took hold of his shirt and asked what would become of him when he turned into a dragon. Kyle was silent for a while. It hurt too much for him to even think about it. So he replied that it didn't matter at all, and she was better off worrying about herself right now. However, Elena still insisted. She raised her voice and said it was important to her. The girl also said that he keeps worrying about her safety instead of his own, and she really resents that. When Kyle heard that, he was very surprised. He didn't understand why the girl had such a strong reaction, and she asked him if he'd ever thought about just running away from it all. She lowered her voice a little, said that the only fate that awaited him in this place was death. So she didn't understand why he wouldn't just try to escape. She, on the other hand, holding him by the shirt harder and harder, said that perhaps it was better to be a dragon than a dead man. Kyle was silent for a while. It was too hard for him to hear those words, but afterward, with a heavy sigh, he said that there was something more to fear than death. Then, smiling, he put his arm around her and told her that what he really wanted was to die like a true human being. He doesn't want to lose himself and end up destroying what he holds so dear. He doesn't want innocent people to get hurt. When the man looked directly into her eyes, he realized that he had seen that look once before. And at that moment, he remembered exactly when the girl had also looked at him. One summer day, they were walking through the garden, and Kyle said he would like her to be his imago. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked him what he meant. The man took her hand and said that it was someone who, like the other half of his soul, always followed him wherever he went, like a reflection in a mirror. And if he could live his life knowing that she would always be by his side, he felt he could even die in peace. At that moment, Elena also remembered a moment from the past and suddenly said something about imago. The man, hearing this, was immediately alert. But she went on to say that in the past an acquaintance of hers had told her that if she could reach someone indispensable to herself, that person could believe that there was an end to all troubles. She dare not, of course, suppose that she could be that kind of person for him. However, she would very much like him to allow her to remain close to him in the same way. The girl, head down, realized that she was not Layla, but he seemed to genuinely believe that she was indeed the one he was looking for. And there's one thing she can tell by the look on his face and his actions this evening. This man he holds in such high esteem is his imago. Of course, that person is none other than Layla, whose mirror image is Elena. Then, after a brief silence, the girl spoke again and said that he had been waiting for her for 8 years now, and she didn't want to leave him here to just run off on her own. She looked the man straight in the eyes and told him that he was the only person who was concerned about her safety as a holy maiden, so she too would like to help him in such a difficult situation. Elena gently took his hand and asked him if he would agree to give up his life from scratch if she could find a way to prevent his transformation. When the man heard this, he became very angry and clenched his fist hard, asking if she really thought he should start his life from scratch. He didn't understand if she could really believe it was even possible, given his situation. In fact, countless scientists, doctors, and episcopians had tried to cure the dragon descendants of this disease, but none could escape their fate, all turning into bloodthirsty dragons. There hadn't been a single exception to this in the history of mankind. Kyle sighed heavily and looked down, saying that this was fate, and it certainly couldn't be changed. The girl hesitated for a while whether she should speak, but then said in a quiet voice that she didn't think so, really. Elena thought about the fact that if what the Archbishop said was really true, then she and Layla were the first holy virgins to be born twins. His words that there were no exceptions gave her confidence, for the cases of her sister were also exceptions, though it had never happened before. And if there is indeed a path called destiny, that path has already taken a new direction and is constantly changing. And all because Elena's very existence is proof of something that has never happened before in her life, but nevertheless, she is alive and well. So the girl turned to Kyle with full confidence and told him that she would definitely find a way to completely turn him into a human, and she intends to do it before the flowers on the tree of life bloom. So she really wants him to give her a chance to prove the man wrong in his beliefs. Kyle listened intently to the girl for a while, but then his emotions took over and he slammed his fist very hard against the wall next to her. Elena didn't even flinch, and the man asked what he needed to say to make her finally realize that she was just putting her life in danger by staying by his side. The girl was actually very scared about the whole situation because she had never seen men so angry before. She thought for a while about what to say. Then Elena, sighing heavily, asked what would happen when he turned into a dragon if she left, and what would become of all the people of this country. Her voice began to rise, and she said that just as he had something he didn't want to lose, she had a dear one she didn't want to just lose either. When Kyle heard that, he was very surprised. He didn't even know what to say to that, so he just kept quiet. Helena already said in a quieter voice that there was no point in her surviving alone. She didn't want to do it without him. Then Kyle started to take his hand away from the girl and asked if she was trying to say that this man's life was as important as her own. Elena said with full confidence that she very much doubted there was much difference in what she and he valued and what they considered important. Kyle lowered his gaze and said that he understood now, then turned around and added that if nothing he told her convinced her, she was free to do as she pleased. The girl was about to say something, but he interrupted her at once and, looking her aside, told her to be sure to remind her that this was her only chance. No more could be given. And if she can't fulfill her promise before the first flower blooms on the tree, he will order her banished from the city. Elena was a little wary and started to worry, but she realized that she absolutely had to fulfill this, so she agreed to this deal. However, Kyle wasn't done yet. He stepped closer to her and told her not to forget that he was his wife until then. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked him what he wanted to say to her in the first place. However, he merely turned around and replied that he would not ask who she held so dear, but he hoped she would not mention that person to him again. Elena accompanied him with a look, not realizing what she had said that could have disturbed him so much. But she curtsied and said she'd keep that in mind too, and she herself didn't realize what was even happening to her. The girl suddenly began to feel something wrong. She assumed that it was probably because she was nervous, but at that moment her eyes suddenly began to blur and she lost consciousness. Kyle, because of being right next to her, was able to react in time and catch the girl before she would have fallen to the ground. Looking closely at her calm face, he realized that there was no strong cause for concern, for she was simply asleep. Kyle then picked her up in his arms and began to carry her around the estate to put her in bed so she could get a good night's sleep. After a while, they finally arrived at the girl's room, and he almost woke Elena up by putting her on the bed. However, she was too tired to wake up. He brushed the hair away from her face and thought about how it felt like he was in a nightmare. The man didn't understand why they'd sent her to him, and not the girl he'd been thinking about all along. In fact, Kyle had never imagined their reunion would happen this way. He sniffed her hair and called her by her real name, Elena, not the one she'd been pretending to be. The next morning, the maids gathered in the corridor. One of the maids asked the head maid if she was really going to wake up His Highness. The older maid was silent, but the others said that some had been hurt trying to wake him up, and they were sure the mistress knew better than anyone else. The elderly woman, who was higher in status than all the other maids, replied that they had no choice, as it had already been half an hour since His Majesty's order to check on His Highness. Then she turned to a maid named Julie, and immediately bowing, went to His Highness's bedroom. The maid knocked, and begging His Highness's pardon, said that she had pronounced a message from His Majesty to be urgently conveyed to him. The other maids also followed her, and when the door did not open for a long time and no one answered, they doubted whether there was anyone there at all. Shortly afterward, however, a rough male voice said she could come in. Julia was a little frightened, but opened the door. As soon as the maid opened the door, she saw His Highness lying on the bed with the girl beside him. She decided to get straight to the point and told him that His Highness asked to see him in an hour. However, the maid immediately shut up after she saw Kyle looking at the girl lying next to her. Of course, that girl was Elena. He then turned his gaze to a maid and asked where his father wanted to see him. The eldest of all the maids stammered and said that he wanted to meet him in his study. Then Kyle started to get out of bed carefully so as not to wake Elena. He fixed her hair and told her he was going there now. And before he left, he asked that when she woke up, they be sure to let her know where the girl was, in order that she wouldn't be confused. At that, he kissed her beautiful golden hair as a sign of farewell, and the maids who saw all this even blushed. A little, for they had not expected that a man could show such tenderness. Some of the maids continued to stand there, but one of them quickly jumped out the open doors and ran somewhere around the estate. She went into the Lord's study and immediately told all she had just seen. The man who was doing his work listened to her carefully. Then he asked, "Does she really mean to say that his brother is head over heels in love with the crown princess?" The maid was very alarmed, but said that it must be true. The man who was signing some papers at that moment got distracted and put a blot, and said that this was an unexpected turn of events. The guy with the bright red hair hesitated and told the maid that this was totally unlike him. Soon after, Kyle quickly changed for his meeting with his father and was walking around the estate, expecting it all already. The man reflected on the events of the previous night and realized that his decision had been too hasty, and he ended up allowing Helena to stay in the palace. However, he couldn't think clearly from the moment he found out that she hadn't forgotten about him all this time. The fact that she remembered that conversation but couldn't recognize him was confusing him. However, the man suggested that it was most likely because he had changed so much since then. Regardless, he allowed himself the excitement of learning that she still remembered him. He decided to distract himself with something else, but still the thoughts kept swarming in his head, and he wondered if that was really the only reason. Kyle suggested that maybe what he wanted was to separate Elena from someone who could be her special someone, just for his own benefit. He continued walking towards his father, and then suddenly stopped and sighed heavily, thinking about the whole situation. At that moment, however, he was interrupted by the voice of Shane, his brother. He came closer to him and said that this was an unusual sight. The red-haired man smiled lightly and said that it wasn't every day you could see him sigh. Kyle was immediately pulled from his thoughts when he saw his brother. He asked Shane what business he had with him, but the guy came closer to him and asked if he thought it was a little cold right now. He spoke a little quieter and said that maybe they mothers were different, but that didn't change the fact that he was his one and only brother. Kyle immediately turned away from him and said that he had absolutely no time for this useless humor. If he had nothing better to do, he could go out and find something else to do. Shane asked how Layla was doing, but when he saw his brother's angry look, he smiled and said it was rude of him to address her that way. The man bowed ostentatiously and apologized for his impoliteness to his dear brother. Shane looked him straight in the eye and told him that ever since the wedding ceremony, all his thoughts had been occupied with only one very important thought. He said he thought he'd never see that woman again, but Kyle couldn't take it at that point. He didn't hold back his emotions and grabbed his brother by the shirt. However, the man, as if nothing had happened, asked why he was so furious all of a sudden. Since this was completely unlike him, Kyle said in a quiet voice, drawing out each word. Whatever he thought there, she was now his wife. So he has no right to be interested in her in any way, let alone his dirty thoughts in his head. Shane wondered, without much enthusiasm, if his brother really thought he had the right to say those words to him. The man realized he was a little over the top, so he let go of his clothes and told him that even if he thought not, if he chose to ignore his warning, he promised him that there would be dire consequences. Shane stepped further away from him and realized that the maid was right after all, for he was acting very unusual. The man also thought about the fact that he probably should have met that woman a lot sooner before all this started happening. Soon, Elena finally woke up and was greeted by a very large number of maids. They bowed and said that from now on they would attend to her needs. The head maid also said that if she has any faults, she should definitely talk about them and not be shy. Helena was telling herself at this moment to keep calm, for it was self-evident that some might think ill of the holy maiden. So she must avoid unwanted suspicions from the maids, whose faces she could already see the displeasure on their faces. When the maid finished speaking, the girl suddenly heard some strange sounds. When she came closer, she saw that it was someone crying. In fact, Elena had been worried all along about whether she could continue to play the role of crown princess, but apparently the maids were too scared to even begin to suspect her. One of them even cried just for fun. The head maid glanced at her charges and told them not to forget whose wife they would serve from now on. She added that if they incurred his wrath, they would not even live to see another day. The maid, who was crying, apologized in a trembling voice and said that it would not happen again. Elena was serious at this point. She realized that they were not really afraid of her, but of the crown prince who could safely punish them. The girl realized that she could not allow herself to be served by those who feared him. Despite the fact that she borrowed Layla's name, but she was the one who promised to find a way to prevent his transformation. And if the girl wants to keep her word, she'll definitely need help. She can't do it on her own, that's for sure. Elena realized that someone who is very much afraid of the crown prince then will only hinder her, so she should only keep those who are not afraid of him or are strong enough to overcome their fear of him. So the girl addressed them, saying that she knew very well that the maid was from a respectable family. At this point, she approached the one who was crying and asked how old she was. The girl replied in a shaky voice that she was already 15. In fact, she could barely contain her new fits of tears and hysterics. But when Elena heard that, she just smiled and said that it was very wonderful. Even though she was still so young, she had come all this way for her family. The head maid approached Her Highness and was about to say something, but the girl immediately interrupted her. She told the maid that they understood perfectly well what she wanted to say. But it could not be denied that most of them had not gathered in this place of their own free will, but only for the sake of their families. Furthermore, Elena also said that being the wife of the crown prince does not negate the fact that she is also the chosen one of the Almighty. Therefore, the girl does not want the maids to make unnecessary sacrifices just for her sake, and she will not forcibly keep each of them. Elena said that if the thought of staying in that place and helping her scares them, she asked that they feel free to go back to a place where they can find peace and where they will be okay with everything. Soon after, many maids left, and only one girl named Julie remained. Elena watched her for a while, then she asked her name. The girl introduced herself, saying her name was Julie West. She moved closer to the maid and asked if she was sure she didn't want to go after everyone else. Elena was about to say something else, but Julie interrupted her, turning to her and telling her that she might not believe her, but she was only in this place of her own free will. When the girl explained that she had a promise that she absolutely had to keep, so even if she wanted to, she couldn't leave. Julie said that 9 years ago, her one and only childhood friend started working for the palace for his family, and the duty that was placed upon him, to stand beside the most dangerous man in the empire and protect him even at the cost of his life. And so, when news of this spread, many tried to dissuade him. But his determination never wavered, and he always insisted only on his opinion. That's why Julie swore to herself that if the man he was protecting found a wife, she would serve her. Elena wanted to ask something about the man her friend was protecting but didn't have time, because there was a knock on the door. When the girl allowed entry, a man appeared in the room. He said he had come at the behest of His Majesty, Crown Prince Kyle. The man in uniform stepped closer and, bowing, told Her Highness that he was honored to meet her. The man said his name was Philip Baldwin, and he was Sir Kyle's personal guardian. When Elena looked at him more closely, she realized that he was the man the Crown Prince had trusted to accompany her last night. Then the girl shifted her gaze to the maid, who stood beside her and straightway did not take her eyes off Philip. Elena immediately realized that he meant more to her than just an ordinary friend, because the girl even blushed a little when he came. In fact, Julia even reminded her of the way her childhood boy looked at her. At that moment, Philip addressed Her Highness and even kneeled down. He said that Sir Kyle had appointed him to be her personal guard from now on, and he asked that the girl feel free to rely on him any time His Highness was purely physically unable to be near her. The man also said that Sir Kyle had ordered him to put her safety first and not to leave her side at all. Elena actually couldn't even think about the fact that he had provided her with his closest assistant, but she tried to push those thoughts away from her, realizing that she shouldn't fool herself. The girl realized that the Crown Prince had obviously done this for Layla's sake, not hers, so she should definitely dispel all these illusions. After all, the thought that he might do this for Elena could pull her into an emotional swamp from which she would certainly not be able to get out. Therefore, the girl must never forget her promise to the Crown Prince. She must focus on what needs to be done, and that there should be no distractions. In fact, Philip has been serving in the Crown Prince's personal guard for 9 long years. But as for Julie, she chose to work there because of her trust in the man. She looked at her new bodyguard and maid, realizing that these two were in this place clearly of their own persuasion. So she figured she could trust them. So Elena turned to both of them and told them that Prince Kyle and her would be in their care from now on. And Julia bowed and said that they would surely serve them up to faith and truth. Elena smiled at them then, and said that in that case there was something she would like to ask them both right now. Seeing their surprised faces, the girl said that she would like to go to a place where many records of the palace's history could be found. She asked if the two of them could accompany her there. The boy and the girl looked at each other and were silent for a while, not knowing what to say. Elena, seeing their concern, asked if there might be some problem with it. Philip hesitated and said that he certainly wouldn't call it a particular problem, but a certain uninvited guest frequented the place. Of course, by uninvited guest, he meant his brother Kyle, who spends almost all of his free time there. Soon, however, they did go to that place, and as Helena walked through the crowd, she saw the maids looking around, and they even began to discuss something. She became uncomfortable and turned to Sir Philip and asked if it would be a breach of etiquette if he walked beside her. The man looked a little surprised, but then told Her Highness that yes, however Sir Kyle told her to follow her order, and wondered if she found it inconvenient that he was walking behind her. Elena said it wasn't that it bothered her, it was just something she wanted to ask, and it would be much more comfortable to talk this way. Philip said she could ask, for he answered her to the best of his ability and knowledge. Elena then replied that she just thought it was odd that unlike the others, he referred to the Crown Prince as Sir Kyle, even though everyone else addressed him more formally. The man said he could see now what she was so interested in, then explained that he had been serving Sir Kyle since he was 15 years old, and it will soon be his 9th year of service. Since he has younger siblings, he remembers how surprised he was when he first met Kyle. He's really not that much different from his siblings, but very soon he realized how wrong he was about that. Elena then wondered how he could be different from other children his age. Philip, sighing heavily, inquired if she knew that Sir Kyle had been summoned by the Emperor this morning. The girl replied that David, the head maid, had told her as soon as she woke up. The man turned away and said that he wasn't sure if Her Highness knew about it. However, Sir had never lost an important battle, including wars with small nations and the campaign against monsters, and it had been so ever since he was 17 years old. The dragon descendants who were born with black blood are raised from birth to be great warriors. Therefore, the reason for his appearance at the bloodwedding ceremony should be clear now. When Elena heard about it, she was very surprised, then said that she certainly understood that he was a dragon descendant, but asked if it wasn't cruel that he had to participate in such battles from such a young age. In fact, being the chosen, powerful one, Layla was forced from an early age to conform to everyone else's expectations, and it was because of this that the girl was constantly unhappy. She couldn't act the way she wanted to act. She had to act the way they wanted her to act. Philip, seeing the girl's distressed face, was silent for a while. Then he smiled slightly and said that he was pleased that she was so concerned about His Highness. They traveled on, and Elena said that it was the obvious thing to do as his wife, right? The man laughed and said that, hearing that, he seemed to understand why Kyle had given him all those orders. Philip also said that this was the first time Sir Kyle had entrusted him to look after someone to this extent. Elena, hearing this, asked in surprise, "Is it really true?" In fact, she hadn't even expected that a man could be so worried. Thoth, for his part, said that it was just like that, and that's why he felt the need to tell the girl about a very important thing before she opened those doors to the vault. The girl was a little surprised. She didn't understand what could be so important to be there and summon people walking around, since he had even stopped. Philip said there are currently 2 candidates in their country who are seen as potential heirs to the throne. As she knows, the first of these candidates is, of course, Sir Kyle, the Emperor's firstborn, and it is he who has been given the title of Crown Prince. Elena then wondered, doesn't the fact that he was given that title in itself make him next in line for the throne? After all, she had thought that was how the system worked. The man said that she had thought it right. However, the people still have a different opinion about it. He said that after the death of the previous empress, the emperor found a second wife. From this marriage was born Prince Shane, the emperor's second son and Sir Kyle's half-brother. Most of the nobles, realizing that the dragon descendant was destined to be short and about life, longed for a ruler who would be capable of long reign, rather than a quick execution. To put it another way, a lot of people believe that Prince Shane will eventually take the throne, as he will outlive his brother. At this point, Prince Shane has never brought it up himself, or shown any indication that he wants to get his hands on the throne. And as they say, you have to beware of the wolf in sheep's clothing, because no one knows when he will start his company. They turned toward the door, and Philip said that the palace library was where Prince Shane spent most of his free time. They saw the guards blocking the way, and the man said that as much as he wanted to stay near the girl, he couldn't. Elena immediately understood and said that apparently only the imperial family and their spouses could go to this library. The guy only nodded at that, and then whispered that if she happened to meet Prince Shane inside, she didn't have to answer all his questions and could even leave if she felt like it. Besides, if the girl was in danger, she should call out to him by name, for right now her safety was more important to him than any imperial decree. In fact, Helena stepped inside and thought about the fact that she wasn't going to stay in this place for long because of Philip's warning. However, after quite some time, she still couldn't find what she was so eager to learn. And so, walking between the rows, she suddenly noticed a brightly colored spine of a book. The girl took a closer look and thought that it might contain the information she needed. She reached up to grab the book from the top shelf, but suddenly she heard a man's voice behind her. He read the title of the book, Oracles and Curse, and grabbed it before Elena could. The man began to scrutinize the book and asked why she might have been interested in it. Seeing the girl's surprised face, he bowed and said that he was the Prince of Shane, and he was very pleased to meet her, Crown Princess Layla. He handed the girl the book she wanted, and Elena at that moment began to scrutinize his appearance. She understood that she should keep all conversations to a minimum, as Philip had advised her. Therefore, the girl took the book and thanked His Highness. However, at this moment, he suddenly grabbed her hand and said that quite some time had passed. Elena tried to pull her hand out. It was all to no avail, however. He pulled her to his lips and kissed her in greeting, telling her that it had been a long time since they had last spoken face to face like this. Afterward, he winked at her and asked, "Isn't it true?" When Elena heard those words, she was very much startled. The girl was more surprised not by his vulgar behavior, but by the fact that he knew Layla personally. Now Elena remembered that every time her sister returned from the palace, she always told her about the prince, but she had never once mentioned meeting Prince Shane. The girl speculated that maybe Layla had just never told her about it because it wasn't true, and now this man probably just wanted to test her. Helena pulled her hand out and bowed gently, asking if he was sure he thought so, for she didn't remember her childhood very well. The girl apologized for not recognizing him, and Shane was surprised for a while, but then only laughed out loud. When he saw her surprised face, he said he thought he should be the one apologizing to her, because it was just a joke. Elena didn't understand why he suddenly decided to make a joke, and the man explained that the only time he'd ever met her was when he'd secretly seen her during her visit to her brother in the past. Shane smiled and said that he was just curious how the girl would react to that, and maybe she had seen him before after all. But unfortunately, he had gotten his hopes up too high. Elena had been silent the whole time. She was already thinking about leaving as soon as possible. But he smiled in turn and asked if she wanted him to show her the library, if she intended to stay there. The girl liked the idea, for she could find out as much as she could and find more books. So she said she wouldn't mind, if he didn't mind. Soon after a short tour, they sat down at a table that stood in the middle of the hall and noticed that it was beginning to get dark outside, and it was even beginning to rain heavily. Shane looked out the window in surprise and said that he thought it was going to be sunny that day, but apparently it was starting to rain, and the weather outside was totally messed up. Elena, for her part, was trying to figure out if the prince would be all right soon, because Philip had said that subduing monsters in neighboring territories was something Prince Kyle did often. However, it is still a rather dangerous action. At this point, Shane began to study her books and asked, "Is this really what she was looking for?" He opened one of the books and said that they all apparently related to the experience of the dragon and the holy maiden. He asked, "Does she really need all this information in books?" This surprises him, for he thought that, being a saintly girl, she knew better than what books could tell her at all. Elena then calmly replied that even though she had been taught various things at the temple, such as the etiquette of the imperial palace, she was afraid that what she knew about the dragon descendant and the holy maiden was derived from the legends most people were familiar with. In fact, when Helena recalled those dark times, the bishops even kept their eyes on the twins so they wouldn't have the chance to learn more about themselves. So the girl knows next to nothing about her sister or dragons. She turned to Shane and asked, "Does he know much about dragon offspring?" Shane laughed and said, "You'd think so. However, like her, what he knew on the subject was no different from what everyone else knew." At that moment, he got up from the table and came closer to her. The man also said that even though he had so much knowledge about the dragon descendant, he knew his brother very well, more than anyone else. Shane smiled and said that he was actually curious even from the beginning about who she was trying to find out more about, himself or his brother. Well, now he supposed he had the answer after all. The man moved closer and closer to Helena and said that he had heard that the Holy Virgin was brought up without knowledge of the outside world until she reached adulthood. He put his hand on hers and said that she was alone in this palace, so he can't imagine how stuffy and lonely she must be. Elena felt very uncomfortable with that touch, and she didn't understand why he was doing all this. When he saw her frightened face, he said it was all right because he knew exactly who he was for his brother's man. In fact, the girl can't deny that her first meeting with the crown prince was full of surprises. However, ever since she sees that he's only concerned about her safety, and yet this man seems to take it for granted that Elena would want to avoid Prince Kyle. In turn, he inquired if he could see her hand for a moment. When the girl held out her palms to him, he placed a small pouch there and asked that she accept a small gift from him and give this to Sasha, his brother. Apparently, he would be more than happy to receive it. Elena was very surprised that he had given her a present. She thought she didn't even know what he was up to, but she had to be alert since Philip had warned her. The girl, in her turn, said that she appreciated the gesture very much, but was afraid that she could not accept it. At that moment there came a heavy knock at the door, and Philip addressed Her Highness. Elena immediately inquired as to what had happened there, and her bodyguard vaulting said that His Majesty had said he wanted to discuss with her a matter concerning the return of Crown Prince Kyle. The girl started to get really nervous and asked if something had happened to him and wondered if Kyle had returned safely at all.